Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Tom Engelhardt, who is a writer and an editor. His books include The End of Victory Culture, Cold War America and the Disillusioning of a Generation, and The Last Days of Publishing, a novel. He is also the producer of an online newsletter of opinion and commentary called TomDispatch. Tom is also a fellow at the Nation Institute. Tom, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you very much.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born in New York City, raised in New York City, and it was in the 50s. I thought I'd never get out.
And we both did.
Yeah, we did.
Looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
Well, my mother was a cartoonist. She was Hirschfield for whatever paper he wasn't at. So I grew up around, I'll tell you one small way in which my world was shaped. I grew up around cartoonists. They always had them over to parties. I can remember Irwin Hazen of Dondi, a strip nobody remembers anymore, but sitting by my bed as I went to sleep drawing Dondi Loves Tom for me. And so when I got into publishing, I grew up loving comics. So so I did a couple of the most successful things I've ever done in publishing were comic books. Art Spiegelman's Mouse, the beginners books, Freud for Beginners, so on and so forth. I'm doing a comic book right now. She left me with a fascination for cartooning and comics and drawing. And
does this also give you a sense of irony and to stand outside of things and see them?
I'll tell you, I have no idea where that comes from. I always felt slightly askew the world, and I was meant not to. My parents raised me. I was clearly to be the successful whatever. I was being raised to hold the banner high and do whatever, and I don't know how I ended up feeling a bit askew our world. But I always say to my students now when I teach that if you feel a little askew the world, it of course gives you a perspective. And it gives you a perspective as an editor too. I mean, you need, in order to write about our world, but also in order to edit the writers who are writing about our world, you need a little bit of distance. Distance does everything.
And what about your father? How did he?
My father was in the insurance business, and he shaped my world in a way I've only realized, I've only understood fairly recently, which was his deepest belief was that you should be your own boss. And among all the things, I rejected a lot of stuff that I thought he stood for. But I've found in recent years that the deepest feeling I have is, in work situations, is anybody above me, leave me alone. I want to be my own boss. It's a very powerful feeling, and I didn't realize it had anything to do with my father until recently. But that and in terms of my writing, he was a vet. He was actually a 36-year-old who went to war, World War II. He was a Jew. As soon as it hit, he volunteered and ended up, of course, in the Pacific, although he volunteered against Hitler. And he came back, like a lot of those guys from the war, very silent. But that war experience, of course, the culture stood in for him. He didn't have to say anything. And I spent much of my childhood growing up in war movies, watching the glory of it all, playing with toy soldiers. I grew up in that kind of post-World War II American triumphalist culture, and it had a great effect on me, and it's one of the major things I've written about over the years. So in that sense, that silent dad, whose place was taken by John Wayne in all my fantasies, had a powerful effect on me.
And then where were you educated? You undergraduate and graduate school?
I went to Yale undergraduate. This was a great triumph for my family, but actually not for me. And then I went.
You should have come to Berkeley right away. Right?
I went to Yale. I overlapped with George Bush, but everybody seemed like George, but not everybody. I had made some wonderful friends there, but I had never, coming from a not exactly wealthy background, I had never run into such blank moral privilege in my life, and it stunned me at the time. And then I was a Jew, and really the quotas had really just come off as I knew nothing about this. I just stumbled into the situation. So there was a certain amount of misery in those years for me, but academically it was fantastic for me because my escape from everything that was Yale was to plunge into my education, and I did.
And what did you major in?
I tried several things and finally ended up in Chinese history because there was a woman, a wonderful, crazed woman there named Mary Wright, the first woman professor at Yale, and I convinced her, I became fascinated with China, and I convinced her to let me go into her graduate seminar as a junior, and from there on I was hooked for a while on. And also, it was the farthest thing I could imagine China from New York City. That's what it came. So it was the most exotic. If you were askew the world, you might as well study China. I think this was my attitude. I didn't think it out, but you know, perhaps China and Jules and Jim were the two things on which I judged you in life. If you didn't like Jules and Jim back in 1964, I didn't bother with you. So I was a terrible, terrible snob of a certain sort.
And then graduate school at?
I went to Harvard, East Asian Studies, and then Chinese history, and then the 60s came along and swept me into another universe.
And what impact did the 60s have on you?
Well, it actually, I think, like a lot of people, it had the impact of turning me a little bit inside out. And I think like a lot of, well, particularly middle-class white boys maybe, but maybe a lot of other people in the 50s, I spent a lot of time looking towards a horizon that didn't seem to be there, wondering when something would happen. You know, the 60s, you know, I mean, it was like the earth opened up and you could just jump in. And I did, more or less, in my own way and distinctly within the bounds of who I was. But I swept out of graduate. First I organized. I was part of the resistance, the draft resistance movement. I organized against the war. And then I ended up, I was swept out of graduate school entirely and became a printer. A so-called movement or underground printer, although we weren't underground at all. And my father, who was basically a working class kid, you know, his reaction was perfectly reasonable thing to be a printer, but why didn't I send you to vocational school, which had a certain point. And then I went west, and you know, by a series of, well, I mean, I'll tell you how I became.
So by west, you meant you came out to California?
I got into a car and came out. I was going to go to the Northwest, but I didn't know anybody there. I ended up in Berkeley. It was the only place I knew anybody.
I see.
And
this would have been what year?
This would have been 1970, maybe. And somebody I knew, very vaguely, came to me and said, "You're a writer, and I know an Air Force medic who's so angry about the war wounded. He wants a journalist. He wants to sneak a journalist into an airbase to do interviews." I wasn't really a writer, and I certainly wasn't a journalist, and I was a very good boy of the 50s. I didn't do things illegal, really, you know, and so on and so forth. But I was so angry about the Vietnam War. So I snuck into this base. I wrote a series of stories. Orville Schell had just started a thing called Pacific News Service. I gave it to him, and the next thing I knew, you know, I was a journalist, but basically I was an editor. I was editing stuff for him. So you know, it was one of those startup things of the moment, an anti-war news service.
So these are the circumstances which brought you to the publishing world in a kind of
actually not quite. I would say even before that, I was in a roiling mass of China scholar, Asian scholar activists who were all starting to write, and they started handing me their stuff. Now, they sent, I didn't even know what an editor was. They clearly sensed something in me that I didn't, and I started editing the stuff, and the next thing I knew, they started getting published. That's how I became an editor.
That's
you know,
very
it was
good.
really happenstance. It was the happenstance of the 60s.
So let's talk a little about the work of editing. How would you characterize the work of an editor? What are the prerequisites? What do you have to be able to do it well? What are the skills required? What sort of a temperament does it take? A lot of questions.
Yeah, and I think the place, you see, it depends on what kind of editing you're talking. One of the things I believe about editing, and it's going to sound strange, is that editing is all about property rights. That is, how you edit depends on who conceptually owns the space within which words appear. Now, for magazines and newspapers, in essence, some corporation owns the space within which words appear. So you can have a set of rules. And I could tell you for a newspaper, these are the rules, this is how I do it.
I see.
You know, because they own it. The writer doesn't own it. So you can say, cut this in half. Or, I mean, we've all gone through this writing pieces. You know, it's too long. You know, conceptually for books, the space between the covers is owned by the writer. I mean, it's less and less true in publishing, but at least conceptually it's true. And what that means is, as an editor, you're always editing. There are no rules because you're editing for that one person. I'm a very unspiritual person, basically, but probably the one spiritual thought I have is that first of all, counterintuitively, the best editing can be done on the best writing. You know, people usually think editors take terrible stuff and make it good. You cannot. You can make something better. The very first job I had, it was in a textbook house, and in essence, they took us into a room. This is as an image. There would be a dead body on the table, and there'd be a group of us. I would rewrite it. Somebody would rewrite what I was doing. And they'd say to us, make it look like it can get up and walk away. And you could do that, but it would never walk. So the best editing is done on the most beautiful writing. And when somebody is a good writer, no matter how they've gotten tangled up in words, they always, I believe, have laid down a path for the editor. So the editor's job is to find the path the writer laid down, to step on it kind of with that machete, and then you just start walking. It's very, at some level, once you've solved certain basic problems, find out where the path is and what needs to be done, it's very simple. You just, that's the feeling I have when I edit.
So it's like clearing the brush,
It's
along a path that somebody else has defined, even though they may not know it.
They may not know it. And what you're trying to do, really, is to help somebody. This is what makes editing completely different from criticism. You're trying to help somebody in an ongoing situation do what they would have done if they hadn't gotten tangled up over here. And you're not trying to do, I mean, with writers, I'll often argue about, you know, I'll disagree with them and we'll have an argument, but I would distinguish between that and editing. You know, we might have a political argument about something. You know, you should do this or whatever, but my basic job is to leave, however close I may be to an author, to leave my own thoughts and to enter the skin. Not the skin. You know, it's very much like a therapist in a way, except I'm not entering a human skin or a human brain. I'm entering a skin of words on a page. And to try and untangle things for that person the way they would have done themselves. And the truth is, I can be quite a brutal editor. That is, if you look at, I had a Japanese author once who wrote me a thank you and said, he had been in World War II, well, I won't tell you the whole story, but he wrote and said, the manuscript looked like Okinawa after the battle, but I do want to thank you. So I can be quite brutal in a sense, but if you're doing for that person what they really wanted to have done, they always know it. No one is ever angry at you. They always feel that you've done it for them. You haven't imposed. What you don't do is impose yourself on them, in essence.
Do authors...
I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. Do authors tend to make similar kind of mistakes, or is each path so unique that your experience and what you do is in a way different for each one? I
think the wonderful thing, it's what makes my job kind of an evergreen or an ever-renewing something. Everything's different. I mean, that's the thing. It's not true with magazines or newspapers because you're in a kind of patterned situation. But with books, at least, I mean, of course, if you edit as I've done for 30-odd years, you run across the same things, the same small and large mistakes many times. But basically, I always feel I'm in a kind of new situation. It's the thrill of it. You know,
and this sounds much more like a craft than it would be if you were in an industrial setting like a magazine or a newspaper. I mean, that's what I'm reading.
That's right. It's more like a craft. That's right, because there isn't as much of a pattern, a preset pattern for it. You know, and I think the other aspect of editing, well, you know, there's a word I often think about because it's such a negative one in our society, which is used. You know, you say either a used car, something's old and not particularly good, or I've been used, I've been exploited. But I think the most beautiful feeling about editing for an editor is that feeling of being used and subsumed. If an author deals with my stuff the way I love, when I get a manuscript back, I don't know that I've been there. The author, I mean, I'll offer many, many suggestions. I'll feel completely free because the author theoretically, and usually the authors I work with will take that manuscript to another level, and whatever I've done will be subsumed. I won't be able to go through and say, oh gosh, you know, I remember doing that and that and that. I'll be gone in a way, and that's quite beautiful. To disappear into someone else's book, to plunge, it's like taking a deep dive into something very strange. So I think it's quite wonderful.
You have a book which is a novel called The Last Days of Publishing, and in it, the main character, who may or may not be you, but offers some interesting tidbits about you know, editing and so on, says at one point the following: to edit means to draw close. But here's the perverse twist. It also means to be alone, for every obstacle removed brings you closer to a manuscript's end. To be a good editor, you have to know when to leap from a manuscript and so from another's life. To do your job, to be subsumed, sooner or later, book and author must make their way as if you never existed.
Yes. I mean, the wonderful thing about writing this novel was I was able to create an editor, and the truth is publishing has been very little written about, so that was interesting in itself, but I was able to create an editor, kind of an alter ego, and a very different editor for me. He edits in a completely different way, and yet we share. I was able to share certain thoughts with this almost living being. For me, I mean, he came to live. He was kind of my opposite in the sense that I'm a very interventionary editor. I'll leap in with my good scrawling hand and both feet, and if you want, I'll edit your life too. I may not do it very well, but I'll try.
Yeah.
And I know editors like this. He's a my character Rick Copps is a listener, and he kind of elicits things from people. And he's not interventionary at all. So he's almost at the other end of the spectrum, although obviously he's quite effective with the people he works with. But it was great fun, in any case, sharing certain thoughts with him. And it is true that you both are subsumed, and then, except maybe on an acknowledgments page, you're gone. You jump ship. And one of the things, for instance, for me, because I deeply believe, I always have, and this is something disappearing in publishing, but I deeply believe that the book is the author's. I don't, for instance, I give the author my suggestions, and I'll make a Xerox in case the author, I mean, my handwriting sometimes is hard to read, so often an author will call and we'll talk over a page or something. But I never, when the new version of the draft comes back, I never look back to see, well, did they do what I wanted them to do? I will literally never look back. I'll start again, and I may say some of the same things because it just comes up freshly. But in the end, I believe the author makes their decisions, and then they leave. And maybe when they're all done, they leave you too. That is, they've done a book with you and they go somewhere else. And I believe authors should be able to do anything they damn well please.
Why did you write a novel as opposed to nonfiction about the world of publishing? Because the book, in addition, this editor is placed in a particular time in the history of publishing.
Well, you know, I'm not sure I can completely answer that. I did it because I did it. It's a little like you know, climbing Everest or something. But I had the feeling it happened. I started writing at a moment when I felt I was losing faith in the word and the book. Something that's renewed for various reasons now, but I had the feeling, I mean, it's an odd reaction to decide you're going to write a book because you're losing faith in the book. I mean, the book, I was sending books out into the world, and it's a world in which, as I like to say, the cultural wallpaper is now screaming. And books are such utterly modest objects, and there's this incredible effort to make them into immodest things because everything else out there is yelling and screaming at the top of its lungs, you know? And at the same time, book companies had all been subsumed, not in such a pleasant way, in giant corporations, and were sitting somewhere in the sub-basements of those giant entities, you know, Viacom or, you know, Time Warner or whoever. And I felt we were that I had lived through a kind of a cultural moment, one that since very little is ever written about publishing, largely hasn't been memorialized. And I had the urge to memorialize it, and somehow maybe I just had always wanted to write a novel, but I also, it seemed the right way to catch the world. It gave me a chance to actually try and catch that world that I had experienced, that I had lived through. I had been there while the cannibals sat at the table and gobbled down publishing, more or less. I had been serving at the table and I watched it, so.
And I guess the world that your character is confronting is a world in which his craftsman's work in this craft of writing, and where the odd, unique book gets married to an editor and then is produced, was really being destroyed by the commercialism, the mergers, the big deals, the packaging of not the book, but the packaging of the packaging, almost, basically.
And the incredible pressures that now come down on. I mean, one of the things I can say, and it's been a great luxury of my publishing life, is if you could take all the books I've done over 30 years, and with one or two exceptions, put them in a bookshelf, and at some level they would have an affinity for each other.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's, that is John Dower's Embracing Defeat, and Adam Hochschild's King Leopold's Ghost, and Mouse, and I mean, Eduardo Galeano's Memory of Fire, they all represented to me what I originally came into publishing to do, which was to bring voices from elsewhere, even when the elsewhere was here, closer to the mainstream, challenging and iconoclastic voices of various sorts. Now, I think that I've done, and I feel there's a coherence to my own life that no editor in the mainstream could really have anymore. It's just not possible. So, and I can remember when I first came into publishing, I came into a big corporation. I was a little house, Pantheon Books, in a big corporation. So the eating had already started, and I was part of the RCA family on arrival. But it still felt a bit like a cottage industry. I can remember the first time we had a deep ethical discussion about, did you put a quote on the front of a book? We had a great quote from Lewis Thomas to go in an obscure book, but the question was it too tacky to do? I mean, now I myself would paste anything on anything. I mean, it's just everything is. Now you just need these endless arrows pointing because there's so much happening out there. It's so noisy out there.
Well, was most of what you edited nonfiction, or
most was nonfiction. I edited fiction only when a nonfiction author, say John Berger, who I edited for years, when he did a book of fiction. I did a few. Actually, I did a little bit of fiction. But Ariel Dorfman, I did a novel of his. I did a Todd Gitlin novel. I've done I do, but I'm not as comfortable editing. I'm not as sure of myself editing fiction. I wouldn't call myself a perfect fiction editor. It's what I actually, where I mostly edit fiction is for friends. I've edited a lot of fiction for friends. I feel comfortable doing that.
You said an affinity. The books, this world that you created of the books that you edited, had an affinity. Let's explore that a little more. Was it they had an affinity in subject matter, or rather in the kind of radical perspective that they viewed the world? Were they askew, like you described yourself earlier?
Yes.
Yeah,
I think they all had that quality, and I mean, they weren't all, because I've done this over many years. They weren't all political or left. I mean, I'm in quite a political world now. I mean, a much more specifically political publishing world, or a set of publishing projects, but they weren't all that way. But they all had the quality, at least, of looking at the world from an unexpected, sometimes an almost unacceptable or an unknown angle, reframing things, you might say. They all reframed the world in some fashion, or most of them anyway.
Do you bring from your radical period a hope that the books that you're working with will change the world in the way that everyone thought the ideas of the 60s would change the world?
I think that is why I started writing that book, because I started to feel that books no longer had the capability to change the world. It was a period I went through, and I'm feeling differently now, because I now feel, looking back at history, it seems to me that the real revolution of the 60s was probably, the successful one was the one on the right, and that was where they started. And the right started.
You're talking about the right wing.
The right wing.
Yeah,
the right wing. This was really what was nobody noticed at the time except them. And the first thing they did was they took the word. They were people of the word. You know, of course they had billionaire beer manufacturers to help them, but they formed think tanks. They put out, project whatevers. They ran seminars. They started publishing books. They did governmental. They started just pouring the word out. This was the essence, I think, of the right. They captured the word. And the left, what was kind of left of the left after those years, kind of a lot of it seemed to. I mean, obviously, a lot of people who thought of themselves as radical or on the left went into daily life and did wonderful things and led normal lives. But the more vocal part went on campus and began to speak in an incomprehensible priestly language. So to me, what's given me a much different feeling in recent years is I feel like that I'm a small part of the beginning of a process of taking the word back. It's a long process, but I think that's happening on the internet where I am now. I'm involved as a co-editor of a book project called the American Empire Project, which is part of a Metropolitan Books where I work, which is part of one of these mainstream
And there you've published Chalmers Johnson, Noam Chomsky. You're going to publish Michael Clare.
I'm publishing a Mexican cartoonist on globalization. I'm going to be publishing James Carroll's columns from the Boston Globe on Bush's crusade and so on and so forth.
Now, before we talk about this new renaissance of the left, let's go back a minute to this discussion of the conservatives and the right wing. Why were they better able to do that? Why were they successful? Was it just the money, or was it that the founding group, which included people who, in some sense, had been liberals before and who became neoconservatives? What was the ignition here in making this victory possible for them, and for them to run with ideas, to make ideas matter and have an effect on policy?
I'm not. You're the political scientist. I think you know this better than I do. I'm not honestly sure. All I can observe is that it happened. That they were successful, and that a major part of it was was that they made themselves into the people of the word. I mean, nobody has ever poured out more pages. And in that period, because I was at Pantheon then, which was kind of...
And this would be the 70s and the 80s?
This was, well, it really started, for the right, it really started in the 60s.
Okay, the 60s.
But it started with teeny pamphlets in the 60s, they mimeoed stuff. But in the 70s and 80s, by the 80s, obviously Reagan had come along, and I was at Pantheon Books, which was kind of the left of mainstream publishing. And you could feel, starting in the early 80s, liberal to left books started to not sell in quantity, and the right books just took off. First of all, there were these right-wing houses kind of on the periphery, and then they kind of moved into the mainstream. And we all know, for 20 years, those were the books that sold. And now, I mean, anybody who's now followed a bestseller list for the last 2 years knows that that it's not that right-wing books have stopped, but that after 20 years, books that are, I mean, left and right, I'm not even sure about these categories anymore, but books that at least once would have been called left, but books like Chalmers or Noam's
Chalmers
book.
Johnson.
Chalmers Johnson's book, Noam Chomsky's book, Barbara Ehrenreich's book, Nickel and Dime, Michael Moore, Al Franken, I can begin to name them. If you actually look, it's quite fascinating, at the Times bestseller list, say this week, you'll find that right and left, 10 of the 15 books, including the kiss and tell-all books about this administration, 10 of the 15 bestsellers are in some sense political books, which is fascinating. It hasn't, basically wasn't true for I don't know how long, maybe not ever, I'm not sure.
The only comparison that one could make is that the right found an audience in opposition to government policy, and that seems to be what's going on right now.
Yeah, that's right. And one of the interesting things about that audience right now is that I think because categories are being scrambled, I feel this on my website, I mean, I now, in the 60s, if I had done, not that there could have been a website, but if I had done whatever the equivalent would have been, I would have had one specific, relatively narrow audience, a so-called left audience. Now, I mean, the people who write in, I mean, genuine conservatives from Southern conservatives who just are anti-imperial. Libertarians, conservatives. I mean, there's a lot of overlap between certain parts of the left and right. I mean, fear of big government, and genuine anti-imperial feelings, the fear of loss of liberties. The difference is, of course, you're getting into bed with someone who's packing a pistol. I mean, if you're me, and I don't mind doing that. I don't mind. No, I'm very
just to change things.
Yeah,
I mean,
I'm very ecumenical. I mean, my stuff. Some of my stuff from Tom Dispatch now gets put up at like LouRockwell.com or I mean libertarian sites. I mean, it's quite fascinating. I mean, I really feel like we're in a new world.
Let's have our audience understand better what it is you're now doing online. You produce several times a week an online newsletter of opinion, commentary, some of it by the opinion columns of others, but a lot of it your own writing. It is an online item which you do yourself, I guess.
I do.
Tell us a little about what the URL is and what your goal is, what you're trying to achieve.
Well, anybody can go to, it's www.TomDispatchcom. And I think what I should really tell you is how it happened, because I stumbled, I mean, I'm 59 years old. I'm much too old for the world I'm in. But
the world of computers.
The world of computers, the internet, at the point when 9/11 happened, I had barely gotten on email. I did not know you could go and read magazines or newspapers anywhere in the world online. I really knew nothing. But I had a very naive reaction to 9/11. Given who I am, I think looking back, it was a very naive reaction, which is I felt that perhaps the horror of 9/11 might actually open Americans up to the state of things in the rest of the world. And after about 2 months of watching what to my mind was endless rights in which we were the world's greatest survivor, victim, and dominator, and left only the role of evil to the rest of the world, and watching the mainstream media coverage around this, I suddenly stumbled online and discovered that you could go and read the Manchester Guardian or Asia Times, that there were all these voices out there, like the voices I had been publishing for years, voices from elsewhere, and that they had different stories to tell. And I started, without even knowing what I was doing, I started sending out to a little e-list, a few friends.
So a clipping service almost.
Yeah, it was a clipping service, exactly, with one line on the top, you should read this. And to a few friends and relatives, most of my relatives jumped off, either bored or angry, very fast. But the interesting thing was, as I kept doing it, I started, 59 years I've been working with interesting people. I've been thinking about this a lot. I've written about the Cold War in America and triumphalism. I had a bunch to say. I started writing at the top of these articles I was passing on, and people started jumping on. Journalists started jumping on.
To the mailing list.
Onto the mailing list. People, they would just write in. I never did anything. And finally, The Nation, Ham Fish, who runs the Nation Institute, which is connected to the Nation magazine, suggested that this be put online as a service. And at that point, I was sending out to 350 or 400 people, and it's now a service I use, like Chalmers Johnson, a lot of authors I work with, they write pieces for me. Various people I've stumbled across, Rebecca Solnit, she writes like an angel, and she writes for me on globalization and other issues. John Dower, who's an author. I mean, various people, Mike Davis, names that you would know. They'll write pieces for me. I do introductions, and then I also, a couple of times a week, do my own dispatches where I wander the web daily for hours, and I put together, in essence, another view of how the world's working, of how Iraq's devolving, or the Bush assault on the environment, or whatever it might be, with a lot of places you can go to. But it's kind of like doing large op-eds with suggested links, something like that. It's called an antidote to the mainstream media, I think.
And what kind of audience do you have now, or do you know?
Well, this is the fascinating thing about the internet. I know that I have over 8,000 subscribers who you can go put your name in and you actually get these dispatches every couple of days. But people visit it without subscribing. There are endless pass-ons because this is part of the thing of taking back the word. I think it's a very powerful thing. People don't really want to introduce their friends to my website. They want to take my thing and 3 other things and send them on to their own list of friends. You know, so this is a very powerful thing. I think it's wonderful. So there are endless, you can't even count. I have a historian friend who passes on to 80 to 100 historians. Who knows?
And so, one can actually email somebody else by just clicking on your site,
you
right?
You can do that too.
Yeah.
And then my stuff now gets posted all over the web, and sometimes it gets printed up in the mainstream every now and then too. But basically, the interesting thing is the web, although a lot of journalists read the site now, there's a real disjuncture between what's happening on the web and what's happening in the media. I was at a media conference on Iraq recently. I was the only person there representing the internet, and people kept saying, you know, Colin Powell gave his UN speech, and 1 year later you get your first critique in the New York Times or wherever. And I would say, but unless you were on internet, in which case if you went to Foreign Policy in Focus, that website, Stephen Zunis did it, you know, did it 1 month later, or the Niger yellow cake story. I had it before the war because Congressman Waxman had posted it at his website. It's just nobody was paying any attention except me. You know, so on the web, there's an increasing world of people, of sites, you know, who are really maintaining a different view of the world, and it's a better informed view of the world largely. Now, on a shoestring.
Yeah, on a shoestring. Now, I'm curious. Your position to help us kind of understand what's going on in the world of publishing, news, the link to entertainment, and on one level, you have to say things are very bad these days.
That's right.
The dumbing down of information, Fox News, the whole. We've gone from Eric Severide and Edward R. Murrow to O'Reilly and company and so on, which
put another way, you know, the latest poll on American attitudes toward Al-Qaeda and WMD in Iraq shows that people, almost no fewer people, believe that WMD was found in Iraq and that Al-Qaeda was linked to Saddam Hussein, and Saddam Hussein.
So they still believe it. Yeah.
And almost exactly the same numbers as back before the war.
Now earlier you had offered a positive note, which were books were getting published. So we have 2 positive elements on the table. So how do these balance each other out? Now the very bad and the hopeful signs that you pointed to.
There's a complicated set of answers to this, but the first thing is, if we were in normal times, I would be completely optimistic. I would say, look, you know, as with the right, maybe it takes 20, 30 years. It takes a long time for something to build. The real problem is that I think time in this world, without being too apocalyptic, despite the title, The Last Days of Publishing, I'm only half an apocalypse. I think we have a limited amount of time to get ourselves together, and I fear what, say, a second Bush administration could do at every level. So in some, normally I would be optimistic. I would say things are developing in an interesting way politically for what I care about, particularly for an anti-imperial point of view on the world. On the other hand, they're not developing fast enough. As far as books go, what I would say is this is an interesting development in the world of books, but one of the contradictions in the book world itself is books are not a major entertainment media. You know, I mean, part of the problem with Stephen King, you sell 3 million copies. That's a failed movie. You know, that's the top of the line. You start down that bestseller list and, you know, you're very fast at 300,000, 200,000, 100,000. I mean, you're really talking, I mean, books are not, the problem is these giant corporations would like them to be a major entertainment whatever. And the problem with the book is it's a very difficult code to break always. You know, I'm always reminded of, there was a day when my son, we were entertaining a friend, my wife and I, in our living room, and our son walked in. He was maybe 5 or 6. He said he wanted to read a book. He hadn't been reading to that point. We said, oh yeah, very nice. He had a little 16-page, 4-line thing. And so we said, sure. And he, by gosh, he sat down and he started reading this thing. Well, very charming for 3 minutes. But, you know, it took him We kept trying to stop him, and he wouldn't stop. It took him like 25 minutes to read this book while our poor friend was sitting there, and by the time he was done, it was very educational for me, because I realized by the time he was done, he looked like somebody who had gotten to the top of Everest without oxygen. And I realized reading, it's like birth, like labor. It's like calisthenics. Your brain is like an Olympic gymnast. We're just not used to, we get so used to reading, we don't think of what's involved. But it's an incredibly labor-intensive activity. It just can't be as mass as turning, I'm a TV watcher, but a sitcom, you got to watch a few times to get the rhythms. Each book, like editing, each book, except a series, you have to break a code. It might take a page or 300 pages. You've got to literally break a code to get in. It's very labor intensive, and it makes it hard for, I think, books to compete in a certain way in this world.
For somebody who comes out of the 60s and had the experience you've described, and who wrote your other book, is called The End of Victory Culture, Cold War America and the Disillusioning of a Generation, which is really an account of how, a descriptive account of how popular culture began to erode around certain themes of war and victory and so on, in part caused by the Vietnam War and events after that. It would seem that 9/11 has brought us to a new place that doesn't reflect a lot of the positive movement that we had thought we achieved. Do you agree with that? And why is that? Why do you think that happened? Was it the nature of the attack that we experienced, or the ability of the administration and its supporters to manipulate our understanding of what's going on?
I would really say all of the above.
Yeah.
And I would say, in addition, I think the thing that I find strange about this administration is, with the exception of Colin Powell, who was in the Vietnam War, almost all these guys, the president, the vice president who said he had better things to do during the Vietnam period, and most of the rest of them managed to avoid, almost literally, it's not just avoid service in the war, they managed to avoid the period in some fashion. And my own feeling is, like the president, that they came out of that same experience I had in childhood of kind of the post-World War II triumphalist movie theater glory of American war experience, which was very powerful. Still, if I watch one of those movies, it sends chills up my spine when the Marines advance and so on and so forth. They arrived in office with those feelings still shining bright. They had missed everything that would have given a kind of ballast to whatever that story was. So they really, in many ways, they're not just replicating the stuff I wrote about. They're not just replicating what I came to call victory culture. They are there's almost something archaic about them, except, of course, they're running our government. They would be very retro if they weren't there doing what they're doing. That's what I think, anyway. I don't know if that makes sense to you. But.
No, it does. Yeah. And so the question then becomes, what then turns things around? You've indicated that we don't have a lot of time. There is some hope out there, but don't these ideas, these books, have to take the form of a real political opposition?
I don't think books themselves can take the form of a political opposition. But I mean, there's no question what I'm doing is putting. What I decided, just for myself, all I can do is speak for myself. I feel at the period, a couple of months after, in those months after 9/11, I think what I really decided in my own mind before I even knew what I was going to do. I had been doing good stuff and good works, and I felt good about it, over the years. But I had the feeling, I've got 2 kids, and I just had the feeling I couldn't bear the thought that I was passing this world as it was happening onto my children without doing something. So I just had the urge to do almost anything. That resulted in TomDispatch by happenstance. But in addition, I had the urge, as I saw exactly the guys you're talking about, as I saw them setting these horrific agendas for the world, I had the small urge to just jump in myself. And I did this with a friend, another editor, and I had the same urge. We just thought, well, why shouldn't we set an agenda too? Of course, we're not going to. We're not megalomaniacs. We just thought, why shouldn't we make the attempt? And so we decided to create this a book series called The American Empire Project, which is very specifically political. It's aimed at the American imperial stance in the world, which I think is the crucial thing we have to deal with, and it'll be there whether it's Bush or Kerry. I mean, those 700 bases that Chalmers Johnson writes about, and so on and so forth. But the question of I kind of do my thing. It keeps my spirits up. I try my damnedest. But can I tell you what we should do? I mean, I would say, I'll go out in the streets to demonstrate. If it's an anti-war demonstration, I'll do whatever. But I can't claim. I'm doing my small bit to help set an agenda, but can I claim that I honestly know what we should? I know one very simple thing, which is that right now we have the greatest gamblers in American history in power. A second administration would be terribly, terribly dangerous, and they do have to go. But whether they'll go is another question. I mean, there's no question about that in my mind, that they're an immediate danger, and 4 more years could be truly disastrous.
So how do you go about with this series? Do you go looking for authors, or do the authors come to you to implement this agenda?
We started off by looking. Yeah, I mean, I for instance, and there was some synergy with TomDispatch, because, for instance, I had been an author I love is the Boston Globe columnist James Carroll, and I had been sending around his outraged columns on Bush's crusade, as he calls it, in the world, for quite a long time. And I just contacted him and convinced him that he should in fact collect the columns, do a book, organize it, and so on and so forth. So that came right out of one thing came out of another. But we're at the point now because we're at this moment, and because, once in a lifetime experience for an editor like me, these books, the first couple of books, turn out to be ragingly successful. I mean, I've had successful books over the years, but they tend to be slowly successful. These first couple have been ragingly successful. So it's been an interesting, if some salesman calls me and says, from our company calls and says, a book you just did sold 300 copies this week in hardcover, I go, oh, that's really wonderful. When people call and say it's sold 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000, you go, oh. So this is it's been an interesting experience. So at this point, we're starting to have people coming to us because I think already the series has a certain, maybe some cachet or something. So
in a way that even in this media that has come to be dominated by companies that have huge conglomerates, even they're making the buck. Allows for an opening to sell books, because we're seeing that with the Clark book, the book by the O'Neill book, and now the Woodward.
Howard Dean's new book.
Yeah.
John Dean's new book, the Woodward book. Well, Woodward always does this, but yes. Yes, so there's a kind of an opening, but the truth is that Holt took a chance. It wasn't so clear when they took a chance on us that this opening was there. Obviously, they hoped it was, because the point for not the point for me, but the point for them is to make some money, and So yes.
So is the key here that the book resonates with the public and its confusion, or is it that your authors are getting on television and being reported? What is making the difference? I mean,
I think here it's pretty clear what's making the difference, which is you have, as often happens in situations, opposites. In essence, the Bush administration has mobilized its opposite, or if not its opposite, it's mobilized, a force in the nation, and there are, again, you don't have to sell a lot of books to be successful, relatively speaking, but there are a growing number of people post 9/11. A minority, but a growing minority, who are deeply disturbed, deeply unnerved, and actually want to understand how the world works. And our series, the basic point, and this is what I think books can do, they can offer you kinds of frameworks for understanding the world in a new way. What I would say at this moment, if you think about this administration and our press, in the Cold War, everything in press terms, everything was globalized. Everything was connected to everything at an almost absurd level. So if there was a strike in Albania or an uprising in Uruguay, it was all connected to the Soviet Union, the United States, and the Cold War, right? Now, here we are, and we have an administration that actually does connect all the dots. Their strategic thought is huge. They see the world as much of the world as a giant so-called arc of instability, and through it they see the energy, kind of the energy lines of they are an energy administration. We have a national security advisor who had an oil tanker named after her. You know, this is how they think. It's just second nature to them. They're thinking about energy flows, not about taking Iraqi oil, but about how to manage the energy flows of the world. So they're connecting the dots. I mean, how many times has Donald Rumsfeld, say, appeared in Kazakhstan? You know, they're moving from place to place. At the same time, our press in these same 2 years has been almost completely demobilized in the literal sense that you can read until very recently, day by day, and not find an article in the United States, in, say, the New York Times, in one of the imperial papers, in which 3 countries were even mentioned. Iraq, but not Iraq and Iran, or Iraq and Iran, but don't mention Afghanistan. In other countries, in other, you know, in the British press or other presses, you know, people are trying to put the world together geopolitically. You can't find that here. Even at the end of the year, you cannot find this sort of thinking. So we've had a demobilized press, and we've had an extremely geopolitically mobilized administration, you know, and I think what I see myself doing in a very, very teeny way, and also our book series doing, is trying to connect some of the dots that aren't being connected so you can see how the world fits together, possibly how the world fits together in various ways.
How would you advise students to prepare for the future in this kind of world? Beyond reading the books in your series, but I mean, but looking back at your own career, is there things that you did that you would recommend for them? A, if they want to understand the world, and B, if they want to write about it, you know, in a way that would meet the high standards you clearly set in your series.
Well, I'll tell you, that's a hard question for me to answer. I'm very hesitant to give people advice. I mean,
only your author. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. At a personal level, maybe. But you know, as far as writing goes, and I say this to my students, you know, Mozart 5, beautiful music. Picasso 9, gorgeous profiles. You know, mathematicians by 15. If you're a narrative writer of any sort, fiction or nonfiction, it's a late flowering form. And although people think a lot about talent, my own feeling is that the major thing about writing is you've just got to write and write and write and write. And the amazing thing is you write in a form for 10 years, you're going to get immensely better. My basic advice to people is, you know, go do it. It's my general advice, I think. Go do it. You feel upset with the world, go out and just do something right in your neighborhood about it. And that's usually what I write back to people. I don't know the bigger picture. I don't know. I hope it all works out. But I think, you know, just don't sit at home. It's my basic advice. Or if you sit at home, do something there, you know.
But if you want to write.
if you want, no, I mean, really. And I certainly, you know, did it from a not until my 20s, but I started partially for me, in the Vietnam period, I was so driven by what was happening that I just felt it was my duty, even though I didn't know what I was doing half the time. I just felt it was my duty to write, and I did a lot of writing in those years for that reason. So I was kind of, in a way that I think often people haven't been in the last 20 or 30 years, just, you know, young people just driven to write. But I was just driven to write, and one of the fascinating things about this TomDispatch experience for me is, as I was saying to you earlier, is that, and I've never had this experience before in my life, I feel possessed by a voice. You know, if you called me and said, Tom, I need you to do an op-ed on, you know, on whatever, I'd spend the same 5 agonizing days doing 1,000 words that I've spent all my life. At TomDispatch, I sit down. It's not that I don't work. I work endless hours on it, but I start at the beginning. I write to the end. I very seldom, unlike in the rest of my life, I very seldom change the order of anything. It's really there. And I feel like it makes me understand. As I say, I'm not in any normal sense a spiritual person, but I feel like if I were in a different moment in history, I think I would believe that I had been possessed by a voice. And then the question would be, whose voice? I don't believe that, so I don't worry too much about it. But I have that. I nonetheless have that feeling. I sit down and it happens. So that,
and what is the ignition here? Is it the times and the clarity with which you see things once you begin putting all these pieces together, and also the fact that clearly you're resonating with an audience and you're getting feedback? Is it those two things?
I think, you know, the resonating with an audience, one thing is that I started writing to friends. So the very tone that I chose was a very natural tone. And it was a lot of blogs are personal in the sense that they're rather narcissistic, and I don't write much about myself. But the tone I chose to write in, and that I kept when it leapt larger, just naturally, is a kind of a personal tone. And so the interesting thing is, this was set up at the Nation Institute by younger people, and the first thing they put up at the site was a little thing you could click on that said, "Give Tom a piece of your mind." Now, this is out of another universe than the one I read. And I said, please, I lived with it for a couple of months. I said, please, get that off. But it still says you can write Tom. And I get 30, 40, 50, 60 letters, maybe more a day sometimes. And they're very, often they're just encouraging. Sometimes people tell me that I'm a miserable coward and anti-American, and you can't go back to they can't say go back to Russia anymore. It's like you'd have to go to Mars. But a lot of it, there's a mother who of a son who's in Baghdad now. She's really quite anti-war. She's very eloquent. She writes me every now and then. She lives in Texas, and people I would have no normal contact with. It's very moving. People from all over the world. I had a taxi driver the other day from Sydney write and say, I just wanted to tell you that our press is even more conglomerated than yours. Murdoch owns it all. But I get home from my taxi driving at 3 in the morning and TomDispatch is there. Because I suppose because of the time difference. So I get all these. So there is I get a sense of resonating with people. People write and argue with me. I wrote recently about the kind of offshore, what I would call a mini gulag of penal camps that we're setting up. I mean, everybody kind of knows Guantanamo, but it's much more extensive than that and almost unwritten about. And one of those holding facilities is at Bagram Air Force Base in Afghanistan. Some guy, maybe it was the PIO at Bagram, he wrote me. He probably Googles up Bagram every day. He wrote me, and he wrote me to say, you and your friends, blah, blah, blah. But he wrote a kind of a thoughtful, argumentative letter. And I wrote him back, and I said, well, first of all, I'm a one-man band, so I don't know who. And he wrote me, and he apologized. He said, okay, I was wrong about your friends. And we had a little back-and-forth argument about the American position in the world. And I thought, fascinating.
So in conclusion, it sounds to me like you're finding a niche where you're doing a kind of editing on a broader scale.
Yes, it is kind of some kind of mix of writing and editing. It's a very interesting place to be.
Tom, thank you very much from taking your time to be with us today and sharing this fascinating intellectual odyssey that has led you to the World Wide Web.
This was great fun. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.